Right, because it is now the Sabbath. And we get an opportunity to also rest. Now, of course, what am I doing? Well, you're working. You know, even in a synagogue, when you go and worship the Lord as a community in a Jewish synagogue, the rabbi gets up and he gives a little sermon. Okay, it's called a drosha in Hebrew, which actually comes from the verb lidrosh, to demand. It's like demanding something from the text. Tell me something that I don't know, type idea. But the rabbis don't think that they're working on the Sabbath. And you go, how do you get around that one? Okay, because the word for work in Hebrew, avodah, is also the same word for worship. Yeah, and so worship is also a work. In fact, this is where sometimes the church sometimes forgets its Jewish roots. Liturgy. Does anyone know what the word liturgy actually means? So often the older churches, the traditional churches, have a thing called a liturgy. A series of prayers and things, when you stand up, when you sit down, when you read the Bible, etc. That actually is the Latin for the work of the people. And you go, and remember, Latin is one of those very old languages where they translated the Hebrew into Latin because it was the language of the day. It wasn't a foreign language, it was like English. And they were taking Hebrew concepts and putting them into the language of the people, and it's still preserved in their language. One of my favorites is, and something that's very unknown by people, usually in the Christian world, or even in the secular world, people think that Easter is named after a pagan goddess. Have you heard that thing? It's actually not. Yes, I know. Everyone's like, what? Yes, it is. Easter, comes from Ishtar. That's what they say. Okay? Actually, it doesn't. The word that actually comes from Ishtar is Esther. Okay? So where does the word Easter come from? I hear you ask. Are there any German speakers in the room? Ja, du kannst auch Deutsch sprechen? Ja, ich habe. The Easter is German. It's very old German. And what do you call Austria in German? Österreich. Easterland. Because Easter is the word for spring in German. Easter is only called Easter in two languages, German and English. Every other language calls Easter Pesach, Passover, including Latin. Right? Yes, it's one of those things where these old languages actually reflect. Yes, the calendar moved, but that's because one's on a solar calendar, one's on a lunar calendar, so it's constantly moving like this. Sometimes it overlaps. But Easter is Passover. Okay? It's 8 days long from Palm Sunday to Resurrection Sunday. Right? That's a very Jewish thing. What we've done in the Christian world is we've tried to paganize everything. And what we should be doing is trying to get to our Hebraic roots and going, why do we have an 8-day festival? That's a Jewish thing. Why do we call this festival Easter when everybody else calls it Passover? Oh, because it is Passover. And why is it different from the lunar calendar? Because we're on a solar calendar. And then suddenly all our issues disappear. Anyway, the Sabbath, it's time to rest. At the same time, a little bit of work and worship put together, and we'll finish off our discussion today on the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because, as we've said already, it's on the lips of Jesus. What have I come to do? I've come to teach the kingdom of heaven. I've come to show what it's like to live when I'm the king. For a bunch of Jewish people, they already had the concept that God was a king. He had redeemed a people. He had introduced himself. He had given them their teaching, the guidance and instruction, and said, make me your king. This is what it's like to live in my kingdom. And people, they took upon themselves that, and they could accept the kingdom of heaven even under occupation. God could still be a king if there was a Greek soldier ruling you, or if there was a Roman soldier. Not everybody could accept that, and there were rebellions, and there were some of them successful, like the Maccabees who give us Hanukkah, and there were some that were unsuccessful, like the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans. But when they came to Jesus and he said, what should we do? He said, look, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and make sure you give to God the things that are God's. Because if he slaps you on the cheek, give him the other one. Right? God will figure that Roman soldier out. In fact, if you happen to be chained to Paul, there's a very good chance you'd become a believer in Jesus. Okay? So he wouldn't leave you alone. But the way Jesus teaches the kingdom, how does he do it? Through parables. Okay. What's a parable? I hear you ask. Well, it's actually a unique teaching device that appears around the time of Jesus, stays around for a couple of 100 years, and then disappears. Okay? The parables only exist in the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels actually, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are no parables in John. There are no parables in Paul. There's no parables in Revelation. The parables only exist in the Synoptic Gospels and in rabbinic literature. You don't find parables in Jewish literature outside the land of Israel. You don't find parables in any of the early church fathers. You don't find parables, no one's writing them today. They're in this little window of around the first century when rabbis are beginning. You see, at the time of Jesus, the rabbinical movement didn't exist. How many people in the New Testament do you know called a rabbi? You know one. Only Jesus is called a rabbi in the New Testament. He doesn't meet another rabbi. He doesn't talk to another rabbi. Who does he talk to? Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, elders. Those were the people who were there at the time of Jesus. Paul is not called a rabbi. When Paul goes around in the book of Acts through the Mediterranean area, he never meets one rabbi. The first person in Jewish literature who's called a rabbi, the first person, is Gamaliel, right, in the book of Acts. Although in the book of Acts, he's not called a rabbi there. He is in Jewish literature, but not in Acts. Jesus is on the cusp of the rabbinical movement. They're just beginning. They've got a temple system, they've got priests, they've got Sadducees, they've got Pharisees, they've got groups living out in the desert, and the rabbinical movement is started where you attract disciples and start to teach. And at the same time, how do you teach? There's this thing called the parable. And it's a unique teaching device. There's a person called, a scholar called Stephen Notley, an American chap. And he went through the rabbinic literature and he found every single parable that there is. And there are 436. And he put them all in a book. And you think, oh, good, I might get that book. It's hundreds of dollars. Okay? It's not a mass-produced book, so that makes it very expensive, unfortunately. But anyway, he put them all in a book, translated them all, and then he made some notes and comments about them. And the summary is this. Every parable is written in Hebrew. There are no parables in Greek. He couldn't find one in Aramaic. The texts, like when you read the Talmud is often in Aramaic. And then there's bits of Hebrew that show up, and then it goes back to Aramaic. So you'd have Aramaic, and then you'd have a Hebrew parable, and then you're back to Aramaic in discussions about the parable. But there was never a parable in Aramaic. It's always in Hebrew. Interesting. So knowing this information, what language do you think Jesus taught his parables in? Hebrew. Right? There are no parables in Aramaic. There are only parables in Hebrew. So, there's a very good chance that Jesus only taught parables in Hebrew. Okay, so you have a unique teaching device in Hebrew that appears at the time of Jesus in the Holy Land. Where do you teach parables, I hear you ask? Well, You don't teach them in synagogues. You teach them out in the marketplace. Therefore, on the road. Therefore, on mountaintops, by the seashore, while you're in a boat. All those things where Jesus discusses with his disciples. But when you get into a synagogue, that's not where you teach parables. You read the Bible, you discuss the Torah. In fact, inside parables, you never quote the Bible. Interesting. You have a teaching device that tells you the truth about the kingdom of heaven, but it actually doesn't quote the Bible. So there's a few interesting little markers about this. Last one. There is no ethnicity in the parable. There is no Jewish marker. There's nothing that says that this is Jewish. For example, a man went out and sowed his field. It never says a Jewish man, and it never says it's the field of Israel. It's always universal. And you go, now that is interesting. A universal teaching device, but only in Hebrew and only in the land of Israel. Yeah, interesting. But if you put your history hats on and your Jewish roots hats on, remember who came out of Egypt? Jews and Gentiles. Who heard the voice of God? Jews and Gentiles. Who was supposed to accept God as king? Jews and Gentiles. Who's supposed to be a light to the nations? Israel. Right? So you've got this teaching device that turns around and says, Gentiles, this actually applies to you too. And this idea is reflected in every Jewish blessing, is it not? So tonight, when Jewish people gather around the Shabbat table, they will light candles and they'll say, "Blessed are you, the Lord our God. You are the King of the..." Not the King of Israel, King of the universe. You command us to be light to the nations. Light some candles. Right? That sort of universal application is already there right at the beginning of the birth of the state of Israel, or the nation of Israel, to its final consummation. God is going to be the Lord of everybody. So Jesus, when he teaches his parables, teaches them probably in Hebrew, outside on the road, with universal application and no ethnic markers. And so here's the question. Is the parable of the Good Samaritan a parable? And the answer is no. Never. You often get the title in your Bible, Parable of the Good Samaritan, except that you know that those titles are not there in the original. Nowhere does the gospel say it's a parable. Okay? In fact, what it looks like is that story actually happened. That was a known story. There was a Samaritan who actually looked after people. And when Jesus is asked, so who's my neighbor? Jesus says, you know the story. You all know the story because it was a real shock to us, right? This Samaritan did a good deed. Wow. And so it's but all other parables have no ethnic marker. So we'll look at a few, and we'll try and see how they apply to us and to the world, and what it means to be taken upon ourselves the kingdom of heaven. Because what is it? It is wherever God is ruling and reigning. There is the kingdom of heaven. How is God's kingdom done? You see it in the Lord's Prayer. We say, our Father in heaven, may your name be holy. May your kingdom come. How? By your will being done. Right? How is the kingdom brought? The kingdom appears on the world when you do God's will. And so for Rosh Hashanah, where they read Genesis 22, the reading for Rosh Hashanah is Genesis 22. That's Abraham offering Isaac. They say, look, there's Abraham doing the will of God, even when it looked so horrible, even when he didn't understand. That's him taking upon himself the kingdom of heaven. Right? Jewish people and Gentiles at the Mount Sinai, where God says, do this, and they say, we don't understand, but we'll do it. Right? They say, this we will do, and then we will understand. That's actually the word. Nishma, we'll hear. Nivna, we'll understand later. Okay? Sometimes you just do what God says, and you figure out why you do it on another occasion. And for many of us, sometimes that's often the way we've had to live life. Sometimes well, God wants me to do this, but I don't know why. And then 5 years later, now I know why. Okay, and but it was that walk of obedience that we had with the Lord that got us through. So Jesus comes, and even after the resurrection, teaches the kingdom of heaven to his students, who then should go out and have done the same thing. All right, so let's have a look at some parables in Mark. Why Mark, I hear you ask? That's because if you happen to be part of a church community that follows a lectionary, what is a lectionary, I hear you ask? The Torah portion, right? The idea of reading the Bible in a cycle, that's a Jewish concept. Older churches still do that, okay? And they have this thing called the lectionary, and older traditional churches are reading through Mark. You read Matthew, then the next year you read Mark, then the next year you read Luke, and bits of John are thrown in there, and then you start again. Every 3 years, you just flip around. So in a lot of churches, they're preaching through Mark. So I thought, let's read some parables of Mark. You could have picked Luke or Matthew, it doesn't matter. Often many of the parables are in each other, although there are a few unique ones in each group, which helps us learn that the Gospels are not copying each other. Like, have you heard of a mysterious document called Q? No? So when I was at Hebrew University, then we were learning about the Bible, and we were told that the New Testament, or one of the professors came up and he said, have you heard this, that apparently there's this mysterious document called Q, and then Mark borrows from Q, and then Luke and Matthew borrow from Mark, and John's just way out there. You heard of that thing? Well, these Jewish professors who are not believers in Jesus said that's a load of rubbish. Okay, that's just typical, 19th century German scholarship rubbish. Okay, no evidence. They're believing in a document they've never found. Not one piece of evidence. Plus, if Matthew and Luke are borrowing from Mark, they're doing an absolutely terrible job. Because Mark's got sometimes more information on stories than Matthew and Luke's, as though they're borrowing it and ignoring it, using different words, different scenarios, different names of people. One's got two blind men, one's got one blind man. So he said, this is a Jewish professor. He says, let me tell you, Christians, how you get your Gospels. And we're all going, ooh, pens at the ready, chaps. Okay, and he said, look, you have the Jesus event. Okay, Jesus came. He's not denying he didn't. He came. He did something. He did amazing things. And you have hundreds of stories of Jesus. They're everywhere. And you don't have one gospel, you have hundreds of them. And what happens is each author is picking stories that he's either familiar with, was an eyewitness to, or heard about, or needed to be put in his gospel. In fact, he says the Gospels even say, Jesus did other things, but this is enough. He says, it's not 1 to 4. He says the Middle East there's lots of stuff. Let's redact it down. This is enough for you. And we're going, oh, wow. He says, that's the way they told the story. Jesus did stuff. Now we have stories. So in Mark, we're going to read a parable that's unique to him. He heard this story. He might have been a part of it. He wrote it down. Luke didn't. Luke didn't see it in Mark's gospel. He just wrote it down. He wrote what he saw down. And so the parable that we're going to look at is in Mark 4. And we'll read a few, but we'll start with this one. And it's the parable of what's called the growing seed, okay, which is in verse 26. And it's a unique story to Mark. And it reads, he also said, the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, is like someone who spreads seed on the ground. Okay? It's no ethnicity. It's a person, a farmer, I guess. He spreads seed on the ground. He goes to sleep, and he gets up night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, although he does not know how. By itself, the soil produces a crop. First the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. And when the grain is ripe, he sends in the sickle, because the harvest has come. And what is this telling us about the kingdom of heaven? What is this telling us about the rule and reign of God? Well, first of all, who's the person who spreads the seed? The farmer. It's a person. It's not God. It's a person. Okay, the person, and what is the seed in the parables? The good news, right? We'll read the parable of the sower next, and we'll get told. It's one of the few parables that Jesus actually unpacks. I mean, he unpacks them all, but our gospel writers don't include that. Have you noticed? Yeah? Like, when you get the parable of the sower, you always get the explanation. And then the Gospels will say, Jesus taught parables to the crowd, and then he would tell his disciples what the parables meant. But the parable of the sower is the only one that he unpacks. All the others he just says, and you don't get any commentary. And you wonder, why did our Gospel writers not include it? And there's people like me who are like, ugh. You know, there's parts of the Gospels where it says, Jesus was on the road to Emmaus, and he told the disciples everywhere in the Bible and the scriptures that were about him. And then Luke doesn't tell us what that was, right? And I know that when I get to heaven, right, the angels will be going, Luke, he's here, run. Okay, because I'll be like, come here, Luke. You know, how dare you say these things and not tell me what it was? Right? And unfortunately, all the gospel writers do that. But they always give us that hint. This is enough. You need to search out. Because what does the proverb say? It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, and it is the honor of a king to search it out. Right? So God hides some stuff, and you go, why would he do that? Because he goes, come look, come search, come find. If you seek me with all your heart, you will find. And there'll be that participation, which is exactly the thing that you're seeing here in this parable. This man, this farmer, goes out and he sows seed. And where's the participation? He's giving the word out. He's sharing the gospel as he is supposed to. That is his duty. That is our duty. And then he doesn't know how the seed grows. It's gone in the ground. He doesn't know how it grows. The sun comes up. He doesn't control that. The rain comes down. He doesn't control that. And then it grows. And all he knows is when it's time to harvest. And so there's this participation that you see in the kingdom of heaven. We share the gospel, and yet we also know that Jesus says, no one comes to the Father except, unless his Father draws him. Right? So, well, if that's true, why should I have to say anything? Because I am supposed to share the gospel, and the Spirit is implanted and draws the new brother or sister to the Lord. They accept Jesus as King. They become part of the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of heaven grows, and it becomes stronger and healthier and etc. through our study, through our devotion, through our time together, through our encouragement with each other, the way we pray, the way we bless each other, cast out demons, heal, etc., etc., etc. All of that is true, because the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom comes when God's will is done. And where is it done? On earth, as it is. Ooh, okay. Has anyone got a King James Bible or a New King James? Yes, the as it is in italics, isn't it? Oh, don't worry, it should be. Matthew 6, I think it is. Then whenever you see in some Bibles, they put words in italics. Do you know why? It's not there in the original. right? It's not there in the original. God's will is done on earth, something, heaven, in heaven, or heaven. The actual word in Greek, are there any Greek speakers here? Is kai. Does anyone know what kai means? And. It appears 8,000 times in the New Testament, and it's always and. But most of us, when we come to translate the Bible, or the translators, they struggle with God's will be done on earth, by us, and in heaven. What? Surely God's will is being done in heaven. Put your Jewish hats on. Where did the rebellion against God start from? Heaven. It was the enemy in heaven who said, God, you are not my king. I want to be king. I don't know how the enemy thought that he could possibly pull that off. Okay, how did he deceive himself? What did he possibly think he could possibly achieve? And as we understand from other scriptures, he takes a third of the angels with him. And then we read in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, that there's a war in heaven. And Michael, with his angels, fights the dragon with his angels, and they clash. But Michael wins. And he casts out the enemy. And so, in Jewish tradition, this is because obviously they don't have Revelation, even though it's written by a Jewish guy, there's a saying, Oseh Shalom Bimromav. Have you ever heard or sung this song? Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu. You sing it at funerals. It means, may there be peace in heaven. Now, why are they praying for peace in heaven? Because they understand that there's a war in heaven, and which is reflected in Revelation. And so here in the prayer of the Lord, he's inviting his disciples to participate, not just on the earth, but also to challenge the angels. We'll do the will of God. You do it too. Stop rebelling against God. Stop the rebellion against the Divine One. Join us in obeying God and making the kingdom here and there. This is why God has to make a new heaven and a new earth. Right? If heaven is perfect, why make a new one? Like heaven's perfect. I can do better. Not possible. If heaven's perfect, it's perfect. And so, but it's got the stain of sin on it. Because rebellion started there and came down to earth. And so God says, when I will get all sin away from me. In the new heavens and the new earth, there will not be one stain of sin. There'll be no more tears. There'll be no more war. Not from my divine beings, the angels, and not from the humans, who are now like angels. But you see it here also in the parable of the growing seed. Participate with me, farmer. Share the word. But by the way, you have no idea how the sun and the moon and the rain work. I'm helping. I'm part of it. You put the seed in the ground, I'll finish the job. And there's this participation, which you see, as we discussed before, with Adam and Eve in the garden. God makes the world, makes some humans, and says, now you be fruitful and fill the earth. Right? The first commandment to the humans is fill the earth, which we then proceeded not to do. Okay? I know everybody thinks that we're overpopulated. We're not. Okay? The earth has never been full, and it has never run out of food. Never once in human history. What it's lost is the ability to share food. We always grow more food. We just never share it. There's a big difference between not having enough and not sharing. Two different things. Right? Humans, Jane, you mentioned it before, I think, once we were talking about, what's the percentage of the land humans live on in Britain? Anyone know? It's 5%. 95% of your country is empty. It might have farms on it, but that's not the same thing as having a house on it. Like we think the world is full because we all live in cities, and then we build a road to another city, and we go, wow, this place is full of humans. But if you actually get on a helicopter and look outside, you realize how empty the land is. And so God says, participate with me in my creation. Fill the earth, take care of it, plant some trees, expand the garden. Was the garden meant to be static? No, it was meant to grow. Okay, if Adam hadn't done what he did, that garden was meant to grow and grow out, and expand, and whatever was supposed, maybe take over the earth perhaps, but it was meant to be that kind of thing. So here you have this growing seed. It will expand, it will fill up, but eventually there will be a harvest. There will be a harvest time. And often there's those hints that are sometimes through the Gospels where and in the epistles where they say, today, work while it is still daylight, because the harvest is coming and we can't work anymore. So let's get involved in the redemptive story. So let's go into the parable of the sower, Mark 4 at the beginning. This is the one where it's already unpacked for us, so we don't have to do too much at all, except that I want us to pay attention to one of the things that Jesus says, which will apply in the parable of the mustard seed a little bit later. Again, he began to teach by the lake. Such a large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat by the lake, and he sat there a while. Right? Do you notice that when you teach, you sit down in Jewish tradition? Okay, we always stand up, and everybody who's hearing sits down. Okay, but in Jewish tradition, you sit to teach. So if you were in a synagogue, guess what the rabbi's doing? Sitting, right? And they're sitting in front of people and just talking. So Jesus sits down, and you stand up to read, which is what you see in Luke chapter 4. Jesus goes into a synagogue, he stands up to read, then he sits down and starts giving his sermon. Very Jewish thing to say. And again here, the gospel writers are reflecting something they've seen, something they've partaken in, and actually put the gospels in their historical context. Big crowd, get into a boat, sit down, start teaching. All right. And he sat there a while. The whole crowd was on the shore by the lake. He taught them many things in parables. And in his teaching he said to them, listen, Shema. Okay? And the word Shema, what does it mean? Hear. What else? Right? Same word. So when you hear the word Shema, listen. But if you hear something, then put it into practice. Right? When you're a small child and mama says, don't, and then you do, what usually happens? You get it, that's right, yeah, you get it. And probably deserved, but right? So if you hear your mother and then do what she says, how much more should you hear God and put that into practice? So whenever you see the word listen in the Bible, think, wow, I really should obey this. Okay, so listen. A sower went out to sow. Again, completely non-ethical. There's no ethnic marker. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path. The birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, sprang up at once, but because the soil was not deep, when the sun came up, it was scorched. And because it did not have sufficient root, it withered. Other seeds fell among thorns, and they grew up and choked it, but it did not produce grain. But other seed fell on good soil and produced grain, sprouting and growing, some yielding 30 times as much, some 60 times, some 100 times. And he said, whoever has ears, let him hear. Okay. So you see there were 4 soils, right? And so there's the 4 types of disciples, the 4 fruits that you gather at Sukkot, and 3 of the soils are unsuccessful in producing fruit, but 1 soil produces a lot, 30, 60, 100, This is where farmers jump up and say, what a load of rubbish. Okay, wheat doesn't produce 100-fold. Well, durum wheat doesn't, which is most of the wheat we grow in the West. But in the Middle East, they've got a wheat called Khorasan. And do you know how many heads that wheat has? 4. So we have in durum wheat is 1 grain with 1 head. On head, 30. But if you're in the Middle East, you have wheat that has 4 heads. And if they're healthy, then all 4 have 30, in which case you do have 100-fold, right? So again, the book is, you can actually still buy Khorasan wheat, by the way. You only find it in health food shops these days. And I don't know why, because it's actually just wheat. It's the same stuff, okay? You go, how can this be called health food and you charge me 4 times the price? Okay. Anyway, what do I know? Okay. But so the gospel writer is again reflecting a reality that actually exists. Okay? He's seen what wheat looks like, and he can produce. So let's go to verse 13. So he said to them, this is Jesus, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The sower sows the word. So now we know in parables that sowers and what they're doing. They're sowing the word. The seed is the word. Okay, thank you, Jesus. And these are the ones on the path where the word is sown. Whenever they hear, immediately Satan comes and snatches the word that was sown in them. So who's Satan represented in the parable? The birds. Okay, so birds in parables are who? Satan. Okay, the enemy. Okay, sometimes the word will be Satan. Sometimes our translations will say enemy, because Satan in Hebrew literally means enemy. Okay, it's not actually a name. It's a noun. Okay, Satan actually does have a name in Hebrew. Does anyone know what his name is? Morning star. Yeah? In the book of Isaiah, his name is Chayil ben Shachar, the morning star. And it's a beautiful name. Why? Because he's beautiful. Right? We often picture him as a demon, as a goat, as all very horrible. The Bible just said, no, he's a bit more tricky than that. Okay? He's the most beautiful angel that God made. And he was the bright morning star, and somehow he fell. Somehow something happened to him. But that didn't mar his visage, per se. But, and then that's actually where we get the word Lucifer from. Because Lucifer is the Latin of morning star. Okay? That's all that is. But often we call him the enemy because we don't really know what else to call him. And he really is, that's his job function, I guess. So birds are Satan, they're the enemy. And they catch the word that was sown on the path that was left out in the open. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. As soon as they hear the word, they receive it with joy. But they have no root in themselves, they don't endure. Then when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, immediately they fall away. And there are going to be those that when push comes to shove, they don't want to stand up for Jesus. Okay, that happens. And Jesus is not going to tell you that it doesn't happen. In fact, he tells it quite openly. He says, this happens. People receive the word. They go, oh, I love Jesus. And they're so happy. And then when someone comes in and goes, believe in Jesus or die, hey, it's cool, you know. And then they back away. Not easy. Okay. Others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those that hear the word, but worldly cares, the seductions of wealth. Now, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, in the first temple period, the problem that Israel had was idolatry. Always worshipping other gods. Every time a new king came, if he was a good one, he tore down the idols. Bad one, put them all back up again. When you go into Babylon, Jewish people have a hard look at themselves and they go, look, we are an idolatrous nation. We're always worshipping idols. We need to stop that. So when they come back from Babylon, no idols. But they had another problem. What happened to them in Babylon? They became wealthy. Because they were told to by Jeremiah. Jeremiah said, look, build houses, get businesses, become part of the system. You're here for 70 years. So they did. And they became quite wealthy. So only 10% of the Jewish people came back. The rest stayed there. And so the New Testament, what's the problem in the New Testament? Money, greed. So much time does Jesus have to spend. You can't serve God and mammon. You've got to watch out for wealth. Paul, money is the root of all evil, or the love of money is the root of all evil, etc., etc., etc. That's the issue that's in the New Testament. And here you have it in the parable too. Seduction of wealth. Okay, not idolatry, something else, something that looks good, something that looks like a blessing. Because it is. If you did something and received a big reward, you would say you were blessed. And you would be. But sometimes, money can also be an issue. And the desire for other things come in, choke the word, and it produces nothing. So the person's still probably a believer, I guess, but he's not producing any fruit whatsoever. So maybe there could be a discussion there if there is a believer or not. Anyway, but these are the ones sown in good soil. They hear the word, they receive it, they bear fruit. 30 times as much, 60 times, and 100. So there's different levels of growth. So now we know what the seed is. We also know what birds are. Excellent. Let's now jump into the parable of the mustard seed. And he also asked, to what can we compare the kingdom of God? And to what parable can we use to present it? This is in verse 30, of Mark 4. It is like a mustard seed that when sown in the ground, even though it is the smallest of seeds, when it is sown, it grows up. It becomes the greatest in all the garden plants, and it grows large branches with the wild birds that can nest in its shade. So what happens? Something that was so small expands and grows. Sometimes other parables will talk about the leaven that grows and builds, and nothing can stop it. Right? We already discussed Satan cannot stop the expanse of the kingdom. He cannot stop the church. He cannot stop the gospel going to the ends of the earth. So what does he do? Hides in it. Have a look at the parable. It grows. And then what came and nested in its shade? Birds. Who are the birds? The agents of the enemy. Where do you find the agents of the enemy? In the church. And what are they doing? Sprouting all kinds of rubbish. Okay? What do we call them? Bishops. Okay? Oops. Okay. Edit that one out. Okay? Some of them. But you understand, it's true, isn't it? There are leaders of the churches who are telling lies. They are not telling the truth. They're not preaching the truth, and they're not looking after the gospel. They're not out there proclaiming the truth. They're just, some of them don't even believe in God. And you wonder, why are you still even there? Yeah. And that's them. Okay? Where does the enemy lie? He could lie outside the church, but yeah, when we meet him, we know who he is. We'll cast out demons. We'll fight him. Missionaries all over the world will tell you some incredible stories about how they went and they beat the enemy and they planted churches and he couldn't stop them. And then a couple of generations later, the church is corrupt. How did that happen? Well, the enemy went, "No, I'll hide inside. And they won't notice me anymore." And that's actually one of the things we have to be on guard about. So again, the parable is teaching us the kingdom of heaven. Have these people made God their king? Sometimes people make God their king and then they live right alongside or work alongside people who have not, and we don't challenge them enough. Okay, we have to be careful with that too. Say, what are you doing here, brother? If you don't want to believe in Jesus, yes, going along the path, that's a different story than being inside the church and trying to tear it down. And so we have to have that that tension of being able to tell people, brother, or like bishop, you've lost your faith. Resign. Go get a job go make coffee. But just don't preach the gospel, because you don't even know what the gospel is. So I know that when I was getting ordained, so I was ordained in the Anglican Church, as Anglican mission. I was very much encouraged to follow that tradition. I grew up in it anyway. And so I took what they call Anglican orders, and I happened to be in Denver at the time. And the Bishop of Denver didn't even believe in the Holy Spirit, right? So it's like, there was no way I was going to let this guy lay hands on me. He's like, what does he think he's doing? And so a friend of mine called Kelvin Crombie, some of you might know who he is, he said, "Oh, Aaron, I got a great bishop for you. He's a missionary. He's really on fire, loves Jesus, and he's in Bolivia." I'm like, "Oh, really?" So I was ordained by the Bishop of Bolivia. So my ordination certificate's in Spanish. I have no idea what it says. I think this says I'm legit, but I've really no idea. Okay, and but there you go. You can find believers and say, "Look, I'll accept your," because that's what bishops are supposed to be. Pastors to the pastor. You can be my shepherd, my pastor, or my bishop. And he's a really good one. I really, really enjoy it. And he is very missional. Right? It's all about how you and Jesus getting on. Right? You know, that's their job, to keep the missionaries online. But the church grows, or the community grows, the kingdom of heaven grows. People who are accepting Jesus as King, as their Lord and their Master, God as King, it grows. You can't stop it, but you have to be careful, because as it grows, the enemy will come in. So there's some great things. It's in a partnership. Heaven's doing it well. You get those ideas that says, look, when you go and share the gospel, it doesn't always work. You share the gospel with a bunch of people, but only 2 or 3 come. But that's still good, because that 2 or 3 go out and do more. You know the story about Billy Graham, don't you? Right? Billy Graham came to faith with somebody sharing him the gospel. And then he went out and saved a lot. Right? This first guy saved 1 person. And then it just exploded. You have no idea what we're doing. What we do know is that God is King and God is in control. There are other parables that reflect even the sentiment that you find in Ecclesiastes. The parable of the wheat and the tares. The sower goes out and he sows his seed, and then the wheat comes up, and at the same time, it says the enemy came and put weeds in it. And then as it was growing, the wheat and the tare and the good and the bad grow together. And the workers were like, well, shall we cut them all down? He says, no, you might hurt the good guys. We'll do it at the end. And that's what you see in the world. The good and the bad exist together in the same city, in the same town, in the same household. Okay, and the Bible doesn't hide from that. It says it happens. So again, surrender it all to God, and the judge will come eventually. But you and I won't do the judging. That will be the Redeemer and his angels. But the parables, again, unique teaching device, reminding the people that, yes, the Jewish people, you're meant to be lights to the nations. Gentiles, you're meant to be part of the story, because you always were at the beginning. And where's the kingdom of heaven? It's wherever God is ruling and reigning. When does the kingdom come? When his will is being done. And where's it being done? On earth, and we hope and pray also in heaven. Any questions? Thoughts? Or as we often say after our devotions at Christ at the office, vehement disagreements? Every time I lead a Bible study, I wait for that's a load of rubbish. It hasn't happened yet, but any other thoughts or questions? Anything you'd like to ask? Are you stunned into silence? So that's okay too. So, all right. Yeah, it's been a long day. Do appreciate your patience with us and your journeying with us. I know that Jane and I enjoyed your presence and being able to teach and share. We appreciate it. We'd like to thank those that organized it, those that sat there faithfully and made the sound work. Appreciate that, brother. Can we call on you to give us a prayer and a blessing at the end?